This is Jeffrey Mishlove back again with Michael Talbot. Michael, now might be a good opportunity to talk in greater depth about some of your own personal experiences. I think maybe building on what you had discussed earlier regarding your childhood experiences with poltergeists. And let's discuss for you personally how the holographic model has helped you to understand these things.
Okay, well, it's interesting. I was asked recently, when did you really start writing the Holographic Universe? And I started writing it years before I heard of the holographic model, because the model of reality that's in the book, that is implied by the holographic idea, is the model of reality that I had arrived at because of my experiences. I'd had a lot of first-hand encounters with the plasticity of reality. A recent one is a good example of just how extraordinary some of these plastic events have been. I have a little jade Buddha on my desk that my mother gave me, and it is set in gold, and she came to visit, and I think it's significant that this was a time in my life I was going through a rather rough period and basically in need of having some reassurance that miracles were possible in the universe. And when she saw the jade Buddha sitting on my desk, she said, "Oh, I remember giving you this," and she picked it up, and I stood by her as we watched it. And as we looked down at the Buddha, there was a little explosion of red light, and a sphere of red light expanded out from the Buddha. And after it was gone, a red stone had appeared in the Buddha's head. And I don't know if it was a ruby or a rhinestone. I've been kind of afraid to have it tested. I don't know how I'd respond if it had been a miraculous rhinestone appearance. But my mother, who's always been kind of like Gladys Kravitz on Bewitched when it comes to these things, kind of giggled nervously and said, "Gee, I don't remember that stone being in the Buddha's head before." And I said, "But Mom, didn't you just notice something really amazing?" And she said, "Well, it looked like there was an explosion of red light, and a sphere of red light expanded away from the Buddha." And I said, "Well, yeah, that's what I saw." And she said, well, that can't be, that can't be. And my sister was visiting and had actually worn the Buddha on a pendant. And so I said, well, she had told me that my sister wore it. And I said, well, let's call her in and see if she remembers it being there, because even I, who experienced these things, you still have this sort of gnawing skepticism, go, gosh, this can't be, can reality really be this plastic? And so I said to my mother, now don't tell her that the stone materialized. Let's,
in front of our eyes.
Right, right. Let's see if she just notices it on her own. Yeah. And my mother, bless her heart, when my sister comes in, she goes, okay, I won't tell her. But the moment she came in the door, she goes, Pam, the stone just appeared out of nowhere in this Buddha's head. So we didn't have, a sort of straight scientific approach to it. But that's just one example. There have been many. I talked about the poltergeist. I grew up having all sorts of precognitive visions of the future, which at a very early age taught me that time wasn't as linear as we thought, and things that we don't even have sort of scientific pigeonholes to put in, like a UFO encounter, and encounters occasionally with beings that appear to be spirits. I'm not quite sure what they are, but beings that aren't physical beings, and things that were just part of the natural warp and weft of my life, have always been. And as I say, it really came as a shock to me to discover that other people didn't know reality was plastic, and that's why the holographic idea excited me so.
Well, now let's talk about it a little more, because I think conventionally people who have these experiences search in our culture for an explanation, and explanations are not readily forthcoming from mainstream institutions. Or you could buy into a religious viewpoint and think of angels, or you might go to folklore and talk about the little people, or you might draw on theosophy or occult traditions. But what added insights do you get out of viewing these things in terms of a holographic model that you don't get from some of these other perspectives?
Well, there are two implications, or two added insights. One is that, the science that we all learned in high school science class does not allow us to understand these things. The holographic idea is really the first sort of scientifically couched idea that says, here's how these things might be possible. But there's another, I kind of think, an even more profound implication of the holographic idea, and this gets back to this notion that Bohm says that if everything is a continuum and infinitely interconnected, all of our ideas, all of the words we use to describe the world are artificial, are sort of just come out of our own belief systems and don't exist out there. And that's something that's had a deep effect on my thinking, because it means when I've had these experiences, I don't jump, as I said, that appear to be spirits. I say this because I've, for example, had a few years back, had an encounter with the spirits of several wolves that appeared that I could see through their bodies. I mean, several wolves appeared in my apartment. I could see through them. They were there for about 10 minutes. And this was an experience that I might easily go, well, these are ghosts, these are power animals, these are demons. But I hold my judgment open. I don't know what they are, but I know that these things are possible. And I think it's important not to jump to conclusions because we may miss the larger picture.
Most people might think I'm going crazy.
Well, I don't anymore. I mean, I never seriously thought I was going crazy because I'm very emotionally healthy, mentally healthy. And these things have always been positive in my life, have always assisted me, and have always been a good thing, helped me survive. And those people who don't know, there were many years when I didn't tell people I had these experiences and no one thought I was crazy. And, you know, they might have had I told them the experiences. But the rest of my life has always been, you know, I'm a very sort of ordinary person except for those things. And I think, you know, that craziness is, if you have an experience of a non-ordinary reality, that's not evidence of craziness. Craziness is if you have some sort of pathological problem, something that's destructive to your health or well-being, and I've never had that.
But I think it might be a bit glossing over from what you've told me already, Michael, just to say that, say, your poltergeist experiences were 100% positive.
Well, that's true, because nothing, I mean, again, we're putting our own intellectual pigeonholes over it. There were negative aspects of the poltergeist.
Would you mind telling the whole story?
Sure. The poltergeist, I always thought the poltergeist started when I was 5 years old, and it started raining gravel down on the roof of my family's home at night. And at the time, we didn't think this was paranormal. No one knew what was going on. I grew up in Michigan. We lived in a very rural area in the midst of the woods. My father would go out with a shotgun because he thought someone must be doing it, and he could never find any evidence that someone was doing it. He'd shoot the gun off into the air. In the morning, he'd go up and sweep several shovelfuls of gravel off the roof. And then things became very definitely paranormal when whatever this manifestation was, went into the house. One of its favorite things to do was to throw the vacuum cleaner around. You didn't always see it. Most often you didn't. My mother, if she were vacuuming and turned the vacuum cleaner off and left it in one corner of the room and would leave the room, you'd hear it crash and go back into the room and be in the opposite side of the room. Occasionally you would see things. I saw on one occasion a glass all of a sudden just came swooping through the room from no apparent source. The windows were closed. There was no one there who could have thrown it. The poltergeist was also fond of throwing, strangely enough, pieces of drift glass and broken beer bottles or pop bottles that you find worn smooth on the beach. And once in my New York apartment, because the poltergeist followed me wherever I moved until I was in my early 20s, I actually saw one of these things materialize. I was just sort of daydreaming, looking up near the ceiling, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this strange little brown thing appeared, and as I looked at it, it came zooming down at me, hit me in the chest, dropped to the floor, and it was one of these pieces of glass. And so these were, you know, extraordinary things, but at the same time, I and my family became so accustomed to them. I have two sisters that if we'd be playing, because another thing the poltergeist would do was stomp all over. It would stomp up the stairs, down the stairs, through the rooms. You hear bang, 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 bang. And if we were playing, it got so, if we heard something stomp up the stairs and glanced over to the stairs and there was nothing there, we'd just go back to playing. It was so mundane a part of our existence. And you said they did have negative aspects. You know, it wasn't all positive. That's true because one of the things that I discovered and has caused me to believe that the poltergeist was an unconscious psychic projection of mine is that it was always colored by my moods. And most of the time I was in a good mood and it was mischievous. It would do silly things, like one morning I woke up with dried spaghetti noodles all over my chest and no explanation. I lived alone and unless a burglar broke in, boiled some noodles, you know, and threw them on my chest, I don't know where they came from, and I have no history of sleepwalking or anything like that. Another instance, it took all of my socks, draped them over the plants in my house. Silly things like that. But if I were in a bad mood, if I were going through some sort of rough time in my life, the poltergeist became nasty. And there were a few occasions, not many, where stigmata-like bites would appear in my hands. A couple of times, needles, or metal objects that were halfway between nail and needle would appear out of nowhere, just zoom into my flesh. This only happened twice. And things like that. So you could construe those as negative, but on the other hand, I view them as positive because I learned so much from them.
Well, I think it's important to mention this because, you know, in a lot of the folklore, these kinds of manifestations are associated with the demonic. And I think by using the lens of a holographic model, you're able to see it in a different light.
That's true, and it's important to note that. And one of the things that I've learned from it is when these negative things were happening, there were occasions, even though I'd had lengthy experience with this poltergeist, that I'd start to think, oh my gosh, maybe I'm being demonically attacked. when I believed that, it started to manifest even more as a demonic attack. But when I would sort of come to my senses and go, no, I know that this is, I can see the emotional reason that this is manifesting in this way, and go, okay, I'm going to stop this, I'm going to, you know, have a positive frame of mind, all the negative stuff would stop. I always had control, but if I relinquished that control and allowed my beliefs to go into some interpretation, go, it's a demon, it's a this, it's a that, then it would get me. And there was another instance where when I lived in my New York apartment, where I was playing piano at night. I had the lights off. I was playing in the dark, and I live on the ground floor, and the piano is situated so that the back of the piano is toward a window. And as I was sitting there playing away, all of a sudden there was an intense burst of light in my face. It was like a flash bulb went off right in my face. And my first just sort of visceral reaction to it was, oh my gosh, a truck is driving, has come off the road and is driving through my window. So I literally threw myself over the piano, thinking that I'm about to be killed by this truck or whatever. And after I sort of regained my, my senses and stood up, I looked back at the window. There was no sign of what had caused this light. And I thought, well, that is strange. And I turned back around, and as I looked in the room, there was what looked like a luminous soap bubble about 3 feet in diameter hovering in the air. And it sounds strange, but it terrified me, because people go, what's so scary about a luminous soap bubble? But it was so unexpected and yet so real. And I started moving my eyes from side to side to see if it was an after image on my retina. I started blinking to see if it would go away. And it was as real as the tables and the chairs. And there was a distinct sort of feeling of evil coming from it. And I started to run out of the room, and then I caught myself, and I thought, because I'm basically just an extremely curious person by nature, and I thought, if I run out of the room, I'm always going to wonder what this thing was and what would have happened had I stayed. So I really summoned my courage, and I stopped, and I addressed it. I said, I want you to know you just scared the daylights out of me, but I want to know why you're here and what you are. And when I said this bubble, which is hovering in the air, backed up. And somehow I knew that the fact that it had backed up, that it had wanted to scare me, and it had backed up. Now, this bubble appearing had been presaged by a number of very negative poltergeist phenomena, a couple of the bites that occurred at that time in this. I didn't know what was going on. The bubble after was only there for maybe a minute or two, but it seemed like an eternity at the time. Then the bubble left the room, hit a door, and sort of burst and sparkles and was gone. But distinctly negative. I knew it was a negative presence. A couple of days later, a friend called me, and I had not told her about the experience or anything. And she said, Michael, I have a letter that I think you should read. And it turned out I had just moved to New York from Michigan. I'd attended Michigan State University. And there was a group of people there that were really only acquaintances of mine. They weren't that important in my life, but they were into black magic. And somehow they had fancied, which was totally their fantasy, not mine, that I was some sort of magician and that I was attacking them. And so they were doing group meditations and casting spells to get me.
Counter magic.
Right. And I had not even thought of these people. Right. But what that taught me is that I realized that, because I still think I was in part feeding this phenomena with my own psychic energy, is that I was not shielding myself. Because what happened when I learned this, while it was going on, I was so interested, I allowed it to happen because I wanted to see where it was going. I wondered what the bubble was. I didn't say, okay, get out of my reality. But as soon as I found out what they were doing, I said, okay, all of this stops now. And just through an act of will, said, this will not go this direction. And as soon as I put forth that act of will, all of these things, the negativity ceased, and the poltergeist resumed its harmless aspects. And what that taught me is that, I'm sometimes asked, do you think people can cast spells or can exert an outward influence to you? And I think that our will is always, it's what our will determines. But you also have to be conscious. You have to sort of shield yourself. And I have learned that I have to have developed a strong belief that I'm protected, so that my unconscious doesn't believe that I'm not protected and allow these things to occur. And when you do that, you are protected.
So your sense is that these various events are taking place at another level of reality that's related to the holographic model.
I do. I think that they're not just hallucinations, and I say that because I've had equally extraordinary experiences where there have been other people present and seen the same things. But what's interesting is, again, as the holographic model says, there's no division between the brain, our thoughts, and the world out there, is that they always have some sort of psychological correlation with what's going on in my life. I can look at them and I can go, the reason this is negative is because these people were casting spells. And there have been event after event after event, or the reason the poltergeist is negative is because I'm going through a bad period emotionally. And so I've discovered that they are psychological exteriorizations that become real. And I say that because, as I say, I don't believe they're hallucinations because other people have witnessed them with me. And the only explanation in my mind is that our thoughts do project into reality on occasion, do bleed through from the subjective to the objective.
Now, I want to explore with you more carefully the nature of the poltergeist entities themselves and these other realities. And I think a good way to approach that would be to step back for a minute and talk a little bit about what is life, what constitutes a living being.
Well, again, we're getting into this area of conceptual pigeonholes putting over, on the universe.
Right.
And it's interesting. In another book of mine, I address this issue at some length, Beyond the Quantum, because if you think about it, how can you define life? There's every time anyone has tried to come up with a definition, well, life reproduces itself, it uses oxygen, whatever your definition is, you can always find something that doesn't seem to be alive that fulfills those criteria. My 6th grade science class, my teacher gave a list of things that categories or qualities that she said, this typifies a living thing. And it occurred to me that fire fulfilled all those qualities. And I said, excuse me, does that mean fire is alive? She said, well, no, obviously not. And I said, well, how does this, mesh with your definition? And this was addressed a few years back in a book called Life Beyond Earth by a physicist named Gerald Feinberg and a biochemist named Robert Shapiro, where they try to come up with a definition of life. And in a strange kind of way, they arrived at a definition that, in my mind, says that everything is alive. They don't quite interpret it that way, but they said life is, the more ordered a phenomena is, the more that you can assume it's alive. But again, order, how do we recognize order? Order is something that we recognize with our heads. And in quantum physics, there's, like Bohm, for example, says that electrons appear to be alive, and he's not alone. There are a number of physicists who think that every portion of the universe is alive. And I think I've come to believe that every small fragment of the universe possesses some life, that it is a manifestation of life, of some kind of consciousness, not a human consciousness, but some kind of consciousness, and you can't draw a distinct border between what is alive and what is not.
I might just mention parenthetically that one of the best works I'm aware of in this regard is Arthur Young's book, The Reflexive Universe, in which he discusses the amazing qualities of a photon that seem to exhibit consciousness.
Yeah, particles seem to make decisions in unique ways. Yeah. You can shoot an electron at a barrier. If you throw a pebble at a window, it either hits the window and bounces off, or it hits the window and breaks through. You shoot an electron at a barrier, it can do all kinds of things. It can bounce off, it can stop just before the window, dematerialize, materialize on the other side. It can stop just before the window and reverse its direction. And you cannot take any electron and predict what it will do, just like you cannot take any human being and with absolute certainty predict what it will do, which is, there's a sort of uncertainty principle in life, and I think it's this quantum indeterminacy that everything possesses, living and what we formerly called non-living.
So as these holographic patterns, these interference patterns come together, they form like standing waves in a sense, and these holographic standing waves can manifest in different ways. I mean, your experiences are quite unusual. I doubt if many viewers will have the kinds of experiences that you have, and yet I think they're very important for us all to know about, because they represent things that are kind of on the fringes of our own experience in different ways. And what you're suggesting is that there's a kind of, I don't know the right word, and of course you pointed out the problems with words, but a quasi-lifelike quality to these poltergeists that it doesn't quite fit the old occult models. Like, I don't...
No, no, they represent... Carl Jung said that our complexes, the sort of belief systems or the agendas that manifest in our consciousness are quasi-independent, that they take on a life of their own, and yet they're a projection of our consciousness. Not a projection, but a manifestation of our consciousness. And to me, the poltergeist was like a complex. It was like one of these semi-autonomous things, but it wasn't only inside my psyche any longer. It manifested, it exteriorized. And I think, there's so many phenomena like this that we try to interpret it as objective. The UFO phenomena is a classic example where it just doesn't seem to fit a purely objective explanation. There are thousands and thousands of UFO experiences every year. Many of them take a very absurd form, and it just doesn't seem possible that we could be visited by thousands and thousands of extraterrestrials behaving so absurdly all the time. And yet the evidence is very substantive that there's something going on. And I'm not the first. Many people have looked at this and said, gosh, there seems to be a psychological quality to these things, and yet they seem to be real. And I believe, I've coined the term omnijective, that the universe is all omnijective. It's neither subjective nor objective, that everything possesses qualities that we associate with both. And the UFO phenomenon, if you look at it, it can almost, I believe, can be interpreted like a dream, that there are metaphors and symbols, that it speaks in the language, what Erich Fromm called the forgotten language, the language of the psyche, this symbolic language of the dreams. And in fact, all of the mystical experiences I've had, instead of looking for them and going, this is an angel, this is a ghost, this is a spirit, I look at them, I go, this is real, and other people have seen it, but what is its psychological meaning? What is it meant to teach me? How is it a projection of my consciousness, my psyche, and perhaps the psyche of those who've witnessed it with me?
Let's go into more detail and more depth about your own personal encounter with this poltergeist, how you came to understand what it really was for you.
Well, you know, I don't know how I came to understand. I always just sort of knew it was a projection of mine. I mean, when I was a very small child, I didn't, because you don't have the intellectual savvy of an adult. But as I grew older, it was just so obvious to me that it was such a direct reflection of my interior landscape, of what was going on in my psyche, that I automatically assumed it was. And it came as a shock to me when I started reading about poltergeists, that people didn't just accept that matter of factly, that of course it is one of the standard explanations is that it's a projection. But there's still people who say maybe it's a spirit, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. Yeah. And so I don't have a specific point in time where I went, aha, this is the event that teaches me. I always just kind of understood it.
But you developed some kind of a relationship with it as time went on.
I did develop a relationship with it, and I guess, you know, the one thing that did help me understand it in those terms was an experiment conducted by the parapsychologist A.R.G. Owen, where he and a group of people got together and they decided to to hold seances, but instead of conjuring up a ghost, they decided to create a ghost. So they named him Philip, and to make sure that they were creating this ghost, what they did is they constructed an artificial history for Philip, but one that contained historical inaccuracies. Like they said, he lived, you know, in the Middle Ages, but the king at the time that he lived was not the king that actually lived in those times. Right. It was a king that had died before.
A fictional ghost.
A fictional ghost.
Yes.
And they held the seance, and there's another interesting thing in this, is that they approached it first by being very mystical and very solemn, and sitting around a table and holding a seance in that way. Nothing happened. Mm-hmm. And then they read about the research performed by an early investigator that said the Victorian seances were always very boisterous. They drank, yes. They laughed, they sang. So they started holding seances where they laughed and they drank and they sang. And boom, Philip started to manifest, would start to answer through table rappings. Mm-hmm. And it became clear that Philip was a projection of the group, in the sense that, like, Philip, for example, enjoyed certain songs. And he's happened to enjoy certain songs that the group enjoys singing. Mm-hmm. However, if one member of the group wasn't there that night, Philip might drop one of his favorite songs and have no knowledge of it. So it seemed that that member was contributing that favorite song. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, Philip was quasi-independent, because he made up some things on his own that no one was consciously adding to his history. One of the things they said is that he had left his wife and fallen in love with a barmaid. And Philip, through this table rapping communication, they said, oh, by the way, I never loved her. I just you know, went away with her, but I never loved her. Mm-hmm. And he came up with that. No member of the group had fabricated that aspect of Philip. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, this too is a quality of the psyche. I learned this once when I was, I used to have a problem where I would nervously pull out the hairs in my beard. And I thought, okay, I've got to stop this. And so just through an act of will, I went cold turkey on this habit, as one has to do with habits. And I was sitting and typing at my word processor one day, and all of a sudden I realized that I was typing with one hand, and I thought, why am I typing with one hand? And I looked down, and my other hand was sneaking up to pull a beard hair out. A part of my psyche was trying to fool myself and pull this out. So it became quasi-independent. That habit was part of me, but it was also
autonomous. You created it, and then it developed. You know,
it develops its own agenda.
Let me speculate a little bit, because throughout this entire program, I've had this urge to pull something out of my eye, and I looked in the mirror earlier, and I realized there are no hairs. There's nothing tickling me. I thought there was, and yet I kept feeling it like that. That could be an example of some kind of a holographic standing wave, or
right. Well,
morphogenetic field, or.
And anyone who's meditated knows that, you know, when you try to quiet your mind, you're assailed by one thought after another, and they seem to assail you, not you bring them in. Mm-hmm. They have their own independence, their own agenda. And when I look at my interior landscape, every emotion, every desire, every feeling I have, I recognize is a part of me, but has its own inner impetus, as self-organized and becomes semi-autonomous and swarms in my head. And I really come to think of myself not as I, but as we, and you know, that each of us is just a plethora of different consciousnesses, thousands, perhaps, you know, uncountable consciousnesses, that our psyche is as rich with these entities, which are part of us. They're not separate from us, but they also have their own agenda. But our psyche is as rich with these things as the Amazon rainforest is rich with life forms.
Mm-hmm. One of the interesting points that you made in an earlier discussion is that many of these phenomena, although they're quite real and they have an autonomous reality after we ourselves have created them, but they might not necessarily be meaningful. They might be striking in a sense,
Right.
but lead nowhere.
Right. Well, I think synchronicities fall in that category. Synchronicities are meaningful coincidences, things that seem to be just coincidence, but occasionally are incredibly meaningful. Sometimes they're not. I had a series of synchronicities where one morning I was doing push-ups, and I had the TV on, and there was a game show, and I wasn't consciously watching the game show, and all of a sudden as I'm doing push-ups, I realized that I answered one of the questions without consciously focusing on what the game show was about. And I said, who was Buffalo Bill? And it was Jeopardy, and the game show, the question had been, you know, William Cody, Buffalo Bill's other name. And I didn't think anything of it. And later that day, a friend called me up and he said, you know, if anyone knows the answer to this question, maybe you do, but we're having an argument here, and my friend's an actor, and he said, were John Barrymore's dying words, aren't you the illegitimate son of Buffalo Bill, to a stagehand that he's collapsed. And I thought about it, I thought, well, there's Buffalo Bill again, but it didn't really sink in too much because it was just the second time it happened. Later that day when the mail came, I got a Smithsonian magazine, and I opened it up, and the article I opened it up to was Buffalo Bill is alive and he's coming back. And so there was boom, 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 Buffalo Bill 3 times in a row. Now, occasionally I have synchronicities 3 times in a row or something like that I look at and I go, oh, this is what this is meant to teach me. But in this particular instance, I thought, this is a kind of little holographic dust storm that's gathered that doesn't have cosmic significance. And I really sort of frown on people that every event in their life they go, this is meaningful, I've got it, what is God telling me because the chair fell here or what. Sometimes they're meaningful, sometimes they have profound meaning, but sometimes they're just these little self-organized exteriorizations of the psyche that are spinning outside of yourself like a dust storm and don't necessarily have meaning.
And I guess the ability to make that distinction, to be able to discern between them, comes from understanding or having a sensitivity to an appreciation for the holographic landscape around us.
Well, to understand how they can manifest, definitely, and equally understanding how the language of the psyche, which we don't do. So we don't even pay much attention to our dreams, and yet we have this enormous, this enormous universe inside ourselves that's constantly giving us lessons and messages. And I interviewed this psychiatrist Montague Ullman for this book, and he said something which I knew, but he articulated in a way that really sort of drove the meaning home for me. And he said that, that he has lots of patients. And he said it doesn't matter who the patient is in the waking state. He can have a man who's a total jerk, but in his dreams there's a wisdom that's way beyond him. That his dreams are constantly trying to teach him not to be a jerk, or not to be selfish, or not to be greedy, or whatever. And I thought, this is true. Our dreams have this wisdom, and yet most human beings don't pay enough attention to dreams to even remember them on a regular basis. They let them in exist in this foggy interior world, and they don't access it. I think it's the Talmud that's written, it says an uninterpreted dream is like a letter left unopened. And I believe that. I think we have to do that as well.
I'd like to push the boundaries even further now, Michael, and I know that you've had personally some UFO types of experiences very much related to the sorts of things that Whitley Strieber reports, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind narrating for us what happened to you and how you've come to view these experiences.
Yeah, I don't mind at all, and they were actually started in something that doesn't seem to be a UFO experience. But when I was 3 years old, I have a memory in my head, and I don't know where it began or where it ended, but it's absolutely vivid to this day, of this woman. I call her a woman, but I don't know, it might just have been an androgynous being, a figure with long white hair wearing a long white robe, taking me out of my bed and walking me through a woods. And I was terrified because I was dark and I didn't know who this person was. The only way that I could deal with it was to sort of tell myself, this has got to be my mother, even though my mother this did not fit the physical description of my mother. We got to the shore of a lake, and this entity that said to me, "Are you afraid, Michael?" And I said, "Yes, I'm very afraid." And it said, "Then hold your hand palm upward toward the moon." I did that, and it said, "Now close your hand," very slowly. And as I did that, I felt a softness in my hand, a palpable softness, like when you hold your hand outside a car window and feel the wind. But there was no wind blowing through my hand. And this being said, "Do you feel that?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Then," or it said, or he said, "Then I want you to remember, Michael, whatever happens in your life, don't ever be afraid, because for you the darkness is soft." And it was a very comforting message. And then a couple of years later, I told my mother about it, and she didn't quite know what, said, no, being took you out or whatever. And, again, when you're a child, you don't process these things intellectually. You just accept the world in a sort of magical way.
How old would you say you were?
I think it was about 3 when this occurred. And when I was 5, my father and a friend saw a UFO come down in the woods near where my family's house was. And it was then obscured by the trees, but out of the trees came 2 figures. First, a man in a black business suit carrying an attaché case, which was completely absurd, and at the time we did not know that this is a common motif in UFO lore, that in UFO experiences they're called the men in black. Of course they don't make sense if they're extraterrestrials, unless they're like, extraterrestrial Amway salesmen or whatever, but so they were just, completely nonplussed by this experience. Then out of the woods came this figure with long white hair and a long white robe, and the man in the business suit vanished, walked off into the thicket and was gone. But the figure with the long white hair and the long white robe stopped in a cornfield and stood there. My father and his friend became very frightened, drove back because my mother, myself, and my father's friend's wife were camping out less than a mile from where this had occurred. They came back and they got us in the car and they said, "This amazing thing happened." They told us the story, drove us up. And when I looked at this being, I thought, "Oh, it's her." I always called her the woman in white. It's the woman in white. But again, as a child, you don't necessarily even mention these things. I didn't say, "Oh, by the way, that's her," to my parents. My father wanted to go see this being, talk to it, and say, "What are you? Why are you here?" My mother said, "No, no, no." And finally, we watched it for about 10 minutes, and finally drove away, not knowing quite what to do, since everyone was too afraid to approach it. The next day, my father went back with a neighbor who taught astronomy at the local Grand Rapids Junior College. And they looked for the landing site of this thing that had come out, which looked like a green ball of light, came zooming out of the air. They couldn't find the landing site, but they did find the footprints of this being in this white robe, and they looked like little skis. They were pointed and very narrow, and they went back into the woods. They took photographs of the footprints with my father's hand next to him for size comparison. Unfortunately, the photographs have been misplaced, but there are lots of people who had seen them at the time. And that experience, after that occurred, is when the poltergeist phenomena manifested in the house. And it's become known now in UFO phenomena that poltergeist hauntings often follow UFO sightings. And this is further evidence that UFOs aren't just a purely objective phenomena. They seem to blow some sort of psychic doorway open in people when strange things start happening. And with me, I believe it blew some sort of gasket open that allowed this psychokinetic essence or energy to come out. And when I look at this and try to interpret it in terms of, as I say, extraterrestrials, it just doesn't make sense. I believe that, I don't quite know what it is, but I believe the universe has many, many levels of reality. I think UFOs are non-physical. I definitely think that we're not necessarily meant to interpret them at face value.
Now, when you say non-physical, are you implying that they're not part of this holographic reality either?
They're a different channel on the holographic television set, a different channel than our physical universe is on, is what I believe. And I think they're uncountable channels on the holographic TV. And probably as many civilizations and such a richness of life on those levels as there is on our own planet, in our own universe, probably. And that there are probably consciousnesses and civilizations that are advanced enough to bleed through. But maybe some of these things also, we don't, they may be like just at the level of wildlife, in their mentality, but on another level of reality. They may not be sophisticated, but they may have the ability to sort of manifest in a form that fools us. And actually what I think is going on is that when you encounter something that is truly of another reality, you can't, your perceptions and trying to pull it out of this blur of energy and make it into a hologram don't quite know how to put it into form. And so I think that the reason there are many psychological motifs in UFO experiences is because there's something going on, but the surface appearance is a product of the person's own psyche.
In other words, a lot of what's going on in these various holographic realities are like ink blots.
Right. They can be interpreted like dreams as well, that they have psychological symbols in them, but they're also something real there, because UFOs can be tracked on radar. They leave circles, on the ground. They leave traces of physical evidence. And so I think, I'm reminded there's a story, I don't know if it's apocryphal, I've never really been able to track it down. It's been attributed to Darwin Magellan, but something to the sense that if you use Magellan, that when Magellan first went ashore in Tierra del Fuego, that the natives saw that he came ashore in rowboats, but he left his ship anchored out in the harbor, and they said, well, how did you get here? And he said, in that ship, and they couldn't see the ship.
Yes.
Now, we certainly know that there's evidence of this. There are tribes in the Gold Coast of Africa that can't see photographs, or can't see movies, and that there's sometimes, that there seems to be our cultural upbringing imprints in us what we can perceive, that sometimes we literally can't perceive something because we don't have the vocabulary, the cultural and perceptual vocabulary to see it. I think UFOs fall into that category in a very extreme way, that they are so alien to our ordinary perception that our brain really pulls deep psychological baggage out of our psyches to hammer them into some form. And when we look at them and read them at face value, like that they're abductions or whatever, I think that we're looking at our own unconscious interpretation of the phenomena, and that we have to go deeper. We have to see beyond our own psychological baggage to truly begin to recognize and understand what's going on.
Well, it would seem to me that it's true that we've been blinded by our culture. We're very much like the people as described in Plato's cave, who can only see the shadows on the wall and not the light. But yet I feel that something's happening. There's a movement in the culture. The very fact that you can take a rather respectable scientific concept like the holographic model of the brain and the holographic model in physics and see that it can be, without a lot of stretching, used to incorporate many of these very things. And Pribram, for one, acknowledges that as well, suggests that right or wrong, the model is helping us to open our eyes to these things.
I think so, yeah. It's interesting, there's sort of a bit of a movement afoot to begin to look at these things, because it's kind of the story of the blind man and the elephant, where they go up, one touches the trunk, one touches the leg, and says, well, this animal's like a snake, no, this animal's like a tree, because they're not seeing the whole picture. And there are various researchers, for example, Ken Ring, who I mentioned earlier, the near-death experience researcher, who said, look, let's look at UFO experiences, let's look at shamanistic experiences, and let's look at near-death experiences, and look at their similarities. Maybe they're all portions of some proverbial elephant that we're missing. And I think he's right. I think that they're all experiences with the other channels on the holographic TV set, and when we interpret them at face value, they're extraterrestrials come here to abduct us and perform genetic research or whatever, we're being like the blind man and the elephant, and we've got to look at the larger picture.
Now, have you, in your adult life, had further UFO experiences as a follow-up?
Well, I have had, as an adult, I had a period when I was in college where I was driving with a friend, and we saw a UFO and got out of our car. We were going from East Lansing, Michigan to Saugatuck, which I believe was something like a 2-hour drive. I'm not quite sure, but we knew how long the drive was supposed to take. We got out of our car to watch this UFO, and we watched it for what we thought was about 5 minutes, and we made no other stops. And when we arrived at our destination, all of our friends said, "Where have you been? You're hours late." And this was the first time that we looked at our watches and realized that we had this proverbial missing time, that we had lost time. Now, I've had people try to hypnotize me, and unfortunately, I have not gone under to be able to access what occurred in that missing time. But I believe that, something, I had some encounter with this non-ordinary reality that we're, in this particular instance, labeling UFO, but as I say, is just the tip of the iceberg of something vaster.
Now, you mentioned the pieces of the puzzle earlier, and one piece that we haven't touched on I'd like to bring in now relates to past lives. You've written a book, Your Past Lives, on this very topic. Do you see it relating?
Oh, I do very much so. I think we human beings know so little about the universe. And I had another personal experience that I had was when I was a very small child. I remembered my past lives, fragments of them. I did not know the word reincarnation. I was very confused. But the memories and my realization that I had lived before were so vivid that I wouldn't call my parents mom and dad. I didn't understand why these two kindly people were saying they were my parents, because I knew I'd had other parents. And I thought, where am I? Why am I here? And I remembered different periods of history, and I didn't know what periods they were. It was a visual memory, and it was very confusing for me. And I would always manifest all these strange habits. I drank incredibly strong black tea. Like at the age of 6, I was brewing myself tea whenever I could get away with it without my parents finding out. I sat cross-legged on the floor. I would never sit in furniture. It took years to train me to sit in chairs. And lots of things. I remembered various ways that I died. I would ask my mother, I'd say, well, do you remember when I drowned? Why did I drown? She didn't know what I was talking about. But as I grew older and learned about the concept of reincarnation, I realized that I had all these experiences. And I want to very quickly say I don't remember being any pharaoh, anyone famous, anything like that. I think unfortunately, there's a lot of nonsense associated with reincarnation. And
such as the idea, why does everybody think they were Cleopatra?
Right, which I think people, if you have 8 people who think they're Cleopatra, you don't have evidence of reincarnation, but of something a bit more frivolous.
Yeah.
And
but the research doesn't show that everybody thinks they were somebody famous.
No,
quite the contrary.
No, quite the contrary. There's a past life researcher, a psychologist named Helen Wambach, who's deceased now, but she regressed large groups of people, hundreds, and sent them back to various past lives. And what she would do is she would pick a time period, for example, the 1850s, 60s, and say, were you alive then, and if so, where were you? Figuring that if people were fantasizing, even at an unconscious level, that they would associate that time period with the Civil War, and she would come up with a lot of Civil War past lives. She didn't. And in fact, in all these literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples of past lives, she had no one who remembered being anyone famous. She also had things that seemed to very much mesh with historical reality. Only 10% of the past lives that her subjects had lived were lived as aristocratic lives or in lives of luxury. The other 90% were grueling as peasants, as laborers, eking out, hunter-gatherers, that sort of thing. And some very interesting historical pieces of information came out. Like she'd started to discover that at various time periods, people described forks as having, like at one point, people said forks had 2 prongs, then they had 3, then they had 4. And this is a very obscure historical fact, but that is the progression of the fork. So there are things like that, but as I say, no famous people, and it did seem to reflect historical reality, not fantasy, because who would fantasize being a peasant or a laborer?
Well, now, we've talked about past lives, we've talked about poltergeists, we've talked about UFOs, and we've talked about the holographic model in science. How do you integrate these?
Well, I think they're all part of the same reality, that we live in a spiritual universe, that I very much believe that our soul lives many, many lives and goes through these things. And I think at this point in our development that we have manifested in the physical because we don't have a consciousness that's developed enough to deal with reality with its full grandeur and plasticity. That for us it would be very frightening if there weren't solid rules, if everything started to slip and slide. But I think as your soul goes along, it starts to learn to deal with more than this reality, with other levels on the holographic television set. And when you start to open those doorways, that's when reality, the plasticity of reality, starts to seep in. But then you go through a sort of shamanistic rite of passage, because you've got to go through, most people go, put an interpretation on it. They go, oh, this is an angel, or this is, a demon, or a UFO abduction. And if you do that, you're missing the basic lesson of shamanism, which is that everything that you experience in the non-ordinary reality of the shaman has psychological meaning for you. That you are entering a level of reality that responds so directly to your thoughts that your every thought helps what manifests. And in that instance, you can't ask what is there, but why have I created what is there? And I think that's the lesson that our souls are learning as we evolve.
In other words, one might say that these various so-called paranormal experiences, or what my friend and mentor Arthur Young would call "oh wow" kinds of experiences, they serve another purpose, and it's not an obvious purpose necessarily, but perhaps ultimately it's to push us somehow into a higher state of consciousness, to force us to try and understand the deeper meaning.
I agree with that, and they're a natural manifestation of the evolution of consciousness. As your soul evolves, you start to open up the plastic levels of reality, and these things start to enter. And that in itself teaches you, that it may not necessarily be that the universe is saying, here I'm giving you this to teach you, but you are manifesting what you have to learn about yourself. Just as we manifest moods and beliefs that we have to learn about if we're to deal with them properly. These are things that manifest in a very profound and paranormal way, but are still Rorschachs, as you said, are inkblots of who and what we are as souls.
Yeah. You speak in your book, The Holographic Universe, of higher states of consciousness, so sort of the evolutionary force of all of this. I wonder if we can go into that now.
Well, I think, as I said, I think that we are evolving as consciousnesses, as souls, and I think that eventually we can move on to other levels of reality, non-physical levels. There are other channels, what I've been calling other channels on the cosmic TV set, the holographic TV set. And I think that to deal with those channels, that we are really just infants. The human race, we tend to think of ourselves as very advanced, but we're really like, one of the metaphors that I use is we're like babies sitting at the control panel of a jumbo jet. Our soul is infinite and has infinite capability, but for us to learn how to access those things, we are at the moment babies at the control panels just flipping switches and occasionally causing profound things to trip into our reality, but not quite understanding them and certainly not controlling them, not seeing that the real evidence, for example, of a synchronicity is that our psyche does have reverberations in the world out there. And if that's the case, how do we begin to really look at how to manifest things, not just simple coincidences, but positive things in our life, and control our thoughts enough that we don't manifest bugaboos and demons and things like that. Because we are like the sorcerer's apprentice. We have to learn to deal with this ability, and that's why it opens up slowly, because before you can deal with it, you don't want those gateways blown open.
And it would seem, I think, that many of the great mystics and spiritual teachers have offered roadmaps or guidelines for entering into these higher states that allow them to integrate all of these phenomena without getting swept away or getting romantic about them, but to see them in a kind of a larger perspective.
Yeah, I think you're right, and it's interesting to me that the one common thread that goes through all these roadmaps is that these other levels of reality are reached through the inner universe, through the head. By going into that inner universe, that's where the vastness of the true universe exists. And in our culture, we think that what's inside our head is less real than what's out there. I believe that what's inside our head is more real than the consensus reality. We just haven't accessed the level that shows us how profound and magical that interior reality is, most of us. Mystics have.
Yeah. And there's even a sense, if we push it, that the very notion of what's inside our head, that we would even think in those terms, is a function of maybe that we're caught in what the Hindus call Maya, the illusion that's created by the holograph. We see ourselves as the holographic projections rather than as the source of those projections.
Right. Well, in the holographic universe, I say that we're children that have not yet learned to color out without coloring books. We can't just freestyle draw, and that's why we're locked in this apparently solid, substantive reality, because for most of us, our consciousness is at a point where if we were thrust into a level of reality where we could instantly manifest as real anything that we thought about, we don't control our thoughts and our emotions enough to manifest only good things. We'd start to worry about something and manifest that. And so for most of us to access those levels of reality would be kind of like being on a very bad LSD trip. And that's why we're growing. But at a certain point, we won't need the comforting borders and boundaries of Maya, of this physical universe. At a certain point, we'll learn how to move beyond.
Well, and that sounds like something of the story that you went through in coming to terms with the poltergeist experience.
Yeah, in all of my experiences. I mean, every one of them has taught me, as I say, not only about the universe, but more importantly about myself and what I have to deal with. Because I think the most spiritual thing a person can do is sometimes people say to me, gosh, I wish I had your experiences. What can I do? Can I meditate? Can I say a mantra? And sometimes the best answer is to see a therapist, deal with your own baggage, because that's what you have to deal with first. I learned this, when I was on book tour, I did a radio interview, a New Age radio interview in San Francisco, where the man who was doing the interview was a substitute host. And he didn't know that we had confirmed the interview, so he was sitting, as the airtime was approaching, sweating bullets, thinking I might not be there. When I arrived, he just bit my head off, really screamed at me and said, how dare you not confirm? And we had confirmed. He didn't know that. And he said, you know, get in here. And so I went into the control room, and he sat down, the light went on, and he leaned toward the mic, and he said, hello. And he started into this New Age thing, and I thought, this is just very wrong. You know, this is not, you know, you cannot be a smiling spiritual person if you've got all this undealt with baggage. And that is the most spiritual thing that we can do, is to learn to deal with the here and now. If you're an insecure person, you deal with your insecurity. You don't try to move objects with your head, you know, with psychokinetically. And those are the things, because if you don't deal with those, you're not going to be in a very pleasant situation in that outer reality, in that holographic reality. It's not going to be pleasant for you until you have this inner peace and health in your own psyche.
Well, now what you're suggesting here is something, I think, more profound than just a simple platitude or a moral truth. What I think, if I can read into what you're saying, it has implications for science. It seems that for the scientific community to be able to come to terms with the many things that we've been talking about and to understand the full realization possible through the holographic model and other comparable models that are being developed now, it's going to require a level of personal development on the part of those scientists.
Very much so.
They just won't be able to get it.
I mean, I'm constantly astounded, you know, reading about some of the individuals, the men who worked on the atomic bomb, and they're asked, you know, well, didn't you ever think of the implications? They go, frankly, no. That's, you know, why? You know, what has happened to us that we can develop something that a brilliant mind can develop an atomic bomb without thinking of the implications? And that's because we don't look at the larger picture. They had their nose to the grindstone, so to speak. They were so interested in the physics of it, they didn't think of what the implications were. And clearly our world is in desperate straits because we've done this over and over again. We've gone off in one direction or another with just one value parameter, you know, without, you know, like, well, this will help us get energy, but it might destroy the ozone layer or whatever. You know, we don't put these spiritual values or become conscious beings before we start wielding these things, and that's, you know, again, that's why we seem to be like infants sitting at the control panel of a jumbo jet. We've got to learn about what's inside to be able to control this control panel before we start flicking switches.
Isn't just a moralism. It seems to be directly implied by the notion of a seamless universe, that we can't separate our personal growth, our moral growth, from our understanding of the world around us. We've reached that barrier.
Well, Bohm says that we have to understand that the universe is an unbroken whole, and that when we fragment the universe, we are leading to our own destruction. You know, when you look at, for example, poverty without looking at education, and he applies it to sociological things like this, that you have to, and we've learned this in the ecosystem, you know, ecologically, you can't say we can do this and it won't affect that. Everything is infinitely interconnected on every level, on every dynamical level of reality. And we have to look at the larger picture, at the infinite interconnection, without focusing in on a fragment of this unbroken wholeness.
Michael, I wonder, we've got about 5 minutes left, if you could kind of synthesize what we've been saying and also talk about what is the next frontier for you in this work.
What I'd like to do next is I'm working on a book that is the practical application of this holographic idea, you know, in all of its various phases, like talking about the placebo effect, and I mentioned the study where 30% of the people taking placebo of a new chemotherapy lost their hair because they were told that they might be taking a toxic drug. We've got to understand that we have this, I call it the infinite self inside us, that has enormous capability, but our conscious mind feeds it all kinds of things unwittingly and gives it all kinds of mistaken directions. You know, for example, I live in New York City, and a lot of people say, well, don't you think the air is killing you? Well, if I look at that placebo study, you know that these people, just that sentence, you know, this drug may cause you to lose your hair, caused them to lose their hair when they weren't even taking the drug. That's the power of our infinite self. We can cause ourselves to lose our own hair. We can cause ourselves to respond in incredibly negative or incredibly positive ways just by the model of reality we hold inside our head. So one has to be very careful. Like when people ask me that about air pollution, I go, well, if I believed I were dying, I know that my body would respond in kind. And I want to write a book that really deals with all these things on all kinds of levels, saying, here are the practical applications. How ways that you don't have to deal with the very sort of heady space-time aspects of these things. Here's the way these things can impact in your everyday life, and that you've got to start looking at, you know, the wonder of these things, but bring them down to the earthly level, so to speak.
I'm kind of puzzled by that, because you use the term the infinite self, and it almost seems to me there's a little catch in there. Like, if you believe you're going to die from air pollution, or now we have all these messages on cigarettes and on alcohol, you know, drink this and you'll get birth defects,
Right.
or other problems, and we think we're doing a good thing, and it suggests that we might want to re-examine some of that. But if we think in terms of the infinite self, maybe it's okay to learn the hard way.
Well, it's interesting, and it's a very, very delicate issue, because for example, I'm not saying throw out nutritional knowledge, but I now know that, like, when I try to eat a healthy diet, but if I eat a candy bar, I no longer tell myself, this is killing me. I bless everything that goes into my body, and I say, this will only make me better, even though I sort of, another part of me knows that I don't want to eat nothing but candy bars.
Yeah.
But I tell myself that everything that happens to me is affecting me in a positive way, not a negative way, because I know of the value of this, of doing this. And the analogy that I use, the anthropologist Gregory Bateson was in New Guinea, where they have these, they use for a currency, these huge stone coins. And so whenever a major financial transaction would take place, they'd have to move one of these amazingly heavy stone coins from one community to another. During one of these events, one of these stone coins sank to the bottom of the ocean. And the fellow who was shipping it to another fellow said, well, everyone knows where it is. It's there down at the bottom of the ocean. It belongs to you now. No one's going to get it. The guy thought about it. He thought, okay, it's my stone coin now. And when he made a financial transaction that necessitated moving the stone coin, instead of moving it, he said, well, now it belongs to you. Everyone knows it's down there at the bottom of the ocean. And I think that's what we've got to do with belief systems. They continue to use the same mode of currency, but without carrying the weight of the stone coins. We've got to use our nutritional knowledge without really affecting and impacting the infinite self. We've got to carry the stone coin around without the weight.
Yeah, that's a very nice analogy. And also, by way of closing, I want to just mention what you said a moment ago, that you always bless your food, because it seems that represents an appreciation for the larger, one might say, holographic dimension or spiritual dimension of who we are and what our food is.
Well, mystics say that everything is an expression of God, and nothing that is an expression of God can hurt you. And I think that's the ultimate message, that we have to look at everything as so interconnected that we can only look at the positive aspects, even though a part of us may sort of implicitly recognize the negative aspects, but we can't put a charge on them, because that activates our own belief systems, the placebo effect, a whole range of things that start to create the hologram in that way.
Michael Talbot, that's a wonderful note to close on. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.